That question of how he got his hands on a gun is one that Toronto police are scrambling to answer. The gun used in the shooting has been traced to the United States. American authorities are helping to narrow down where it came from. CBC News is quoting a police source saying that his brother seems to have been the immediate source of the gun used in Sunday's shooting. We know that many of the guns used to commit crimes in the city come from the United States. Many of them as well come from within Canada. Here's the Chief of Police, Mark Saunders, speaking with Toronto City Council yesterday.
When we look at our research, it's clear to us that 50% of the firearms that are used for crimes are domestic, usually straw purchasing. So lawful owners who purchase large amounts of firearms and then distribute them to the criminal entities that are out there.
Mark Saunders, Chief of Police, speaking yesterday. City Council ultimately voted last night to call on the federal and provincial governments to ban the sale of handguns and ammunition in this city. For now, though, you can still legally buy a gun in Toronto. How does that work? What can that tell us about the holes that exist in the gun control system that is in place here in this country? James Wu is the store manager at G4C Sports Gun Store in Markham. He's with me in studio now. James, good morning.
Good morning.
If I walk into your store and I don't have a license, but I want to buy a handgun, what happens?
First of all, when you come into the store and you want to look at a handgun, we ask for your license. If you don't have a license, unfortunately, we cannot even take it off the shelf to show you.
The guns are on display. I just couldn't hold the gun.
They're on display behind the counter in a glass shelf, but you cannot hold them unless you have a license.
How long would it take for me to get a license? How does that work?
It's a very lengthy and complicated process. First of all, you need to contact a certified firearm instructor within your area, and the available instructors can be found on the RCMP's website. From the time you register for a course, which takes about, say, roughly 20 hours of class time, you have a full Saturday and Sunday plus a weekday evening. Once you complete the course, you need to write an exam. And once your exam's completed, you need a minimum of 80% on your written part and your practical part to pass the exam. Then your result gets sent to the Chief Firearms Office in the OPP. They certify it, send it back to you. At that point, you're about a month and a half, 2 months into the process. From there, you send in your application along with your certified test result to the RCMP's office, which by law, they have a minimum of 28 days from the date they receive the application until they can start processing it. So generally, although the minimum requirement is 28 days, generally it takes about anywhere between 2 to 4 months to actually have them process your application. And in that stage, they do background checks, mental illness checks. They call up your references, verify your photo, and if you have you're living with somebody, common law, or even if you had a ex-wife, ex-girlfriend, those are all the people they need to contact before they will issue you a license.
Then I get my license, then I can buy the gun.
And it's even if you get your license, if you want to purchase a handgun, you can't just come into the store, pay for it, and take it home. The system in Canada is, I'd say it's a sophisticated system where even if you have a license, anytime you want to purchase a handgun, there's another application that gets submitted to the Chief Firearms Office in your province, and they have to look at the application again to approve it before that handgun is legally transferred under your name.
How many handguns can I buy with that license?
Legally, there's no limit on how many you can buy, but each one that you buy, each time you require a transfer of a handgun, there will be another application.
Why would anyone need a gun in this region?
I mean, I could ask the same question, why anybody needs a car that drives over 100 kilometers an hour if we don't live in Germany, right? It's a hobby.
Do you have a gun?
Yes.
Why do you have a gun?
It's like I own cars that drive faster than 100 kilometers per hour.
We're talking about guns, right? Not cars. So why do you have a handgun?
It's the same with people that does collections. I mean, I'm interested into history. So I collect stuff that has historical meaning, and that's not limited to firearm. Things, books, photo albums. So for that reason, people have different reasons.
City Council yesterday voted to, and I asked that because the mayor has asked that question. The mayor has asked why anybody would need a handgun in this region. City Council voted yesterday, and the mayor voted in favor of this, to ban handgun sales in Toronto. They're going to ask the provincial and federal governments for that ban. What's your reaction to that?
Well, we live in a democratic world. So if the majority decides on a decision, as law-abiding citizens, we follow the majority. So if that ultimately comes down to the city's decision, I'm a law-abiding citizen. I follow the law. And at the same time, I was actually listening to your show on the way here this morning, and earlier you were talking about airline CEOs getting put into coach to have an interview. So it's another interesting aspect to think about for lawmakers or decision makers when they make decision. Should they maybe go through the process first to understand the process?
Why somebody would own a gun?
Yeah. Or on top of why somebody will own a gun, like say for the mayor of Toronto, does he know the complicated process of acquiring a license? And then on top of that, the legal requirements for storing a handgun, the lengthy requirements for transporting a handgun. So that's another, in my opinion, a good question to ask.
Just finally, before I let you go,
Yeah.
we heard the chief of police in that little clip saying that 50% of the guns used in crimes in the city are legally purchased guns. He said that people are coming and buying through straw purchases guns that then are sold on the black market. If that's the case, what is it that a gun store owner like you can do to prevent that?
To the best of my knowledge, as a legal firearm owner, you lose a handgun, you are going to be charged first.
But this isn't about losing handguns. It's people who are selling the handguns. They're buying guns for other people, essentially, through straw purchases.
Right. So the problem here is every single handgun in Canada is registered. And if this gun turns up to be used in a crime, the police can trace it back to who was the last legal owner of the firearm. And everybody that I know in the community are law-abiding citizens. Nobody would risk their life, their career, and their family to take on such a risky move. So in that sense, I really don't know anyone who would do that.
Your perspective on this is fascinating. Again, we often talk about gun control and how the guns get into the city. People may not know the steps that you have to take to be able to purchase a gun in this region. James, thanks for being here.
You're welcome.
James Wu is the store manager at G4C Sports Gun Store in Markham. Police are trying to figure out how the man behind the Danforth Avenue shooting got a gun. The gun has been traced to the United States. American authorities helping to narrow down where it came from. Toronto police have told CBC that they believe his brother may have supplied the gun to him. We also know that the shooter had mental health issues. His family says he suffered from psychosis and depression. Wendy Sukier is the president of the Coalition for Gun Control here in Toronto. She's with me in studio again. Good morning.
Good morning.
Just quickly, your response to what we just heard about the steps that need to be taken to buy a gun in this city. That's a long process. I think people perhaps maybe thought it was a shorter process. They may not have known some of the details. Is that process extensive enough?
So he was describing the process for buying restricted firearms. You're more likely to get called as a reference for a passport than as a reference for a firearms license. So while applicants are required to provide references, the follow-up secondary checks in the system are often not done, and that's part of the reason why we've seen with most mass shootings, not this most recent one, very often the shooters are law-abiding gun owners who belong to local gun clubs. So there are some real gaps in the legislation itself. That's part of the reason we've seen the number of restricted and prohibited weapons double in the last 10 years and why there are more than 1 million, even though they're supposed to be restricted and prohibited. That tells you that in spite of the processes that are outlined, the application of them varies quite considerably.
You and I spoke, I guess it was last week,
Yeah.
about the number of guns being used, and this is what the chief was speaking about as well, the number of guns that are being used in crimes that aren't coming from the States, but they're actually from here in Canada. He talked about how, legal gun owners aren't going to risk their livelihoods, aren't going to risk, by selling off a gun. He doesn't see those straw purchases. If he doesn't see that, how are those guns ending up in the hands of people who are causing mayhem in the streets? What's that process?
Well, it's kind of analogous to me saying I don't know anybody who drives drunk. But the fact is lots of people drive while they're impaired. So with respect, we know that 7,000 guns are reported stolen every year. If your guns are not registered, and rifles and shotguns now aren't, you're less likely to report them stolen. So theft is one avenue.
The chief specifically talked about the idea of straw purchases yesterday.
Straw purchases,
which means you're going to buy a gun on behalf of somebody else.
Absolutely. So in the same way that criminal groups often use kids with clean records to carry out certain tasks, there are formal processes. But if we go back in time and you look at big investigations that have been conducted around the illegal flow of firearms, it's mixed. There are dirty dealers, so people who look law-abiding on the surface and sell some guns legally, some guns illegally. There are people who import guns legally and they accidentally, on purpose, disappear them between the border and the gun store. There are law-abiding gun owners who may not be thinking about the risks when they lend their guns to friends. It happens. It doesn't have to happen a lot to create a big problem.
City of Toronto, through its council, wants to ban the sale of guns and ammunition in the city limits. He lives in Markham, so I'm not sure what that actually means.
That's York. That's not Toronto.
But it's not Toronto. But is that actually going to do anything?
I think symbolically it's important. I think that if anyone's serious about banning handguns, it has to be federal. I mean, we know from the experience in the United States, Washington, D.C. had a ban on handguns, which was eventually struck down by their Supreme Court. But you ban guns in Toronto, presumably they can flow in from Markham. I think what is really required is very concerted efforts to lobby the federal government to strengthen the law. As you know, last time I was here, I talked about Bill C-71. I talked about the gaps in that legislation and the fact that Toronto MPs, frankly, did very little to try to address those gaps. Maybe there's an opportunity with the Senate to strengthen that legislation to at least undo the worst of the damage that was done by the Conservatives.
There are also questions, just finally, about how somebody who apparently had a mental illness would be able to get his hands on a gun. Now, again, we're learning that it may have come from his brother. But is that an issue that needs to be addressed as well?
There's no question that the screening processes are intended to address people with mental health issues who are a risk to themselves or others. In this case, that may not have applied if the gun was obtained illegally. But some of the healthcare organizations, for example, have suggested that as with cars, physicians should be obligated to notify authorities when they think someone is a risk in terms of firearms ownership. Again, that requires cooperation between federal and provincial levels of government, but that would be a very specific measure aimed at addressing the mental health problems, because often the people doing the screening have no access to information, and if they don't have the resources to follow up with references, or the references lie, or the healthcare professionals don't think the person is a risk, you don't get the results you want.
Wendy, thank you.
Thank you.
Wendy Sukier, president of the Coalition for Gun Control, national organization. She's also the founder and director of the Diversity Institute at Ryerson University.